everyone, it's Lisa from My Dreaming Soap. Welcome to my channel and thanks for dropping by. Now you may be wondering what all these black squiggles of soap are that I've got. Well, this video isn't going to be a massively technical soap, it's really just to show you a technique that I use every now and again. Just because I'm probably a little bit weird when I say this, I actually really do not like mica lines, so I just do something different when I want to sort of achieve the same effect. So all I've done is I've made up some black soap and I then actually extruded mine as soon as it was saponified through a thin extruder, just so it would be as fine as possible, and I laid it out on a tray and I let it dry up so that I could then just blend it into tiny little bits. So I'm just going to give it a few pulses in my blender. Now this is a blender that I just keep for my soap making. I use it to mix up my titanium dioxide and my activated charcoal and blend my mica lines. Now you could do this in all sorts of different ways. I specifically made some soap from scratch because, as you know, I've got tight regulations on what I can put in my soaps, so I have to know the exact content. You could do this by shredding up really small bits of older soap that you've got. It'd be better if it's all a single colour, to be honest. The main thing to be aware of is to make sure your soap is as dry as possible before you blend it. Which for mine, because it was freshly made soap, that's why I actually extruded it into really skinny strings and laid those out and allowed those to dry for a couple of days. I have actually done this with salt bar batter as well, and that works really well. If you literally just make up some salt bar batter, and as you know with salt bars you would typically unmould them after a couple of hours. At that point you can crumble up those salt bars really well and then again seal that away, and you don't even need to blend it, you just crumble it up and it works brilliantly. At the end of this video I'll show you some salt bars where I've actually used this technique. I'm going to use what I call my not mica line in just a nice straightforward layered soap. I won't be needing all of it, so I'll typically make up a reasonably large batch of it, and then the excess I just pop into an airtight container, seal it up, and then just put it away, and then I can just sprinkle it in soaps when I need it. I'm going to make this layered soap using separate mini batches. Now, sometimes I think people get a little bit confused about when they should make it all up together in a whole batch or whether they should do separate mini batches. My advice would be, if you're not after too many individual layers, or if you're not worried if your layers are particularly flat and smooth, then just mix it all together up in one batch and very lightly blend it just to an emulsion, maybe not even that, and then split off the bits that you need to pour in. If, however, you do want lots of layers and you want nice straight flat layers, you're far better off doing lots of separate mini batches. There is actually option 3, and this works quite well as long as you know your recipe and you know your fragrance oil. If you've got an accelerating fragrance oil, not one that seizes, one that accelerates really quickly, so therefore you know that you can mix it in, it will literally stay fluid for a few seconds whilst you pour your soap into the mould and bang it down, and then it sets up, then that's a great fragrance oil to use for your layers, because you can then mix up your whole batch, leave the fragrance oil out of everything, split off a little bit, mix the colour into it, add the fragrance oil at the last minute and then plop it into the mould, bang it down, get it nice and flat, and then do the next one. Okay, so back to the soap that I'm actually making now. My first layer is going to be this purple colour, and I'm using Purple Passion from You Make It Up. I'm fragrancing my soap today with good old black raspberry and vanilla. I know that's a really common fragrance, but there's a reason why it's really common, because it is really lovely. And I do like this version that I've got. I'm using mine from Sensory Perfection in the UK. So I'm just going to finish bringing this up to an emulsion and a light trace. Now, another thing I always feel when you're doing layers is make sure you're pouring your soap into the mould whilst it's pourable. A lot of people talk about getting themselves to a thick trace because they want to do the layers and they want them to set up. Anytime you're having to scrape something into the mould or use something to flatten it out manually where it doesn't flow into a nice flat level, you are not going to get a flat layer. So I often see people pouring it in, doing it quite thick, leveling it out with a spatula or something, and it doesn't give a level soap no matter how high you try. If you did it with a proper scraper, you'd get a better level. So keep that batter fluid. I know it may be a little bit annoying that perhaps you have to wait a few more minutes for the soap to set up for you to do your next layer, but that's when your accelerating fragrance oil could come in handy, or maybe just wait a little bit. Now, I'm not too worried about mine being completely flat for this soap because the mica lines that I'm doing, I've left the granules of my mica, or my not mica line as I call it, reasonably chunky, so it's not going to give those really crisp flat edges. So once I'm at a trace, I'm just going to pour it into the mould. I am using my spatula. I always find it's better to pour over something to break the fall of the soap. Now you might think, why the dickens are you breaking the fall of the soap into the bottom of the soap mould? It's not about it breaking down into another layer, it's about the soap not spinning round and creating air bubbles. You know, every time, if you ever watch say like a tap running into a sink or something, as the water hits the other water that's already in the sink, it creates a little sort of vortex, as it were, and it creates bubbles. So anytime you can slow the speed that batter hits other batter down, then it means less bubbles in your soap. Okay, so there's our first layer done. The black raspberry and vanilla that I use does actually accelerate trace a reasonable amount, not fast, but certainly I'm not going to have to wait too long for this to set up. Literally a couple of minutes and it'll be fine. So then I'm just going to grab my mica granules, let's call them. Now, you do still want that soap to be a little bit tacky, so don't go away for hours and leave it to set up completely, because you do want these granules to be sticking in. And then, just like you would do with a normal mica line, you can sprinkle them on the top. Now, the advantage with using these granules is they're actually made of soap. So therefore, they will stick to the soap underneath and they will stick to the soap that you pour on top of them as well. So as long as you don't go and put a ridiculously thick amount of them in here, you shouldn't have a problem with your soap breaking apart. And you can get a nice, decent mica line, or not mica line, through your soap. So once I'm happy with my granule line, I'm going to make up my next layer of batter fairly quickly so I can then get everything all binding together nicely. Now, this is just a layered soap. It's going to be the same process over and over again, so I'm not going to talk through every single one of the layers. What I will do is I will explain to you why I say I don't like mica lines. So as you can see here, we're just doing a white layer next, and all of the layers are going to follow exactly the same process as we've seen with the first layer. Okay, so first of all, overall, I do like the look of a mica line. When you see the soap with a mica line in it, it does look great. I'm not denying that. Here's my things I don't like about them now. Point 1. They make a blinking awful mess when you try and do them. Now, some colours are better than others, but something like doing activated charcoal for well, that's not really a mica line, is it? But you know what I mean. Lots of people use activated charcoal. They do make a mess, and it's difficult to not get it all over the sides of your mould and all of that sort of thing. Now, I know people use tea strainers and various sprinklery things and, tights or whatever over the top of pots and all sorts of things to try and help it out, but they still cause a mess. The second issue that I have with mica lines is separation. Now, so commonly in soapy forums and Facebook groups and that sort of thing, you hear people talking about the fact that they tried to do a mica line and their soap fell apart. Now, this is really common. You have to be very, very careful about the amount of mica that you put into a mica line. And ideally, you want to have it so that it's not completely covering the surface. There should be some little gaps. There should be some moist bits. You should really use a puffer or something to blow the excess off. And also, different things you use for mica lines have different effects. So, for example, something like activated charcoal is far more absorbent than micas are. So the activated charcoal will suck the moisture out of your soap and therefore be more likely to cause it to fall apart than if perhaps you've done a mica line actually with some mica. Now, I'm not saying that using these granules is going to stop your soap ever falling apart. Of course it's not. If you put a really thick line in there, so you've just got granules touching granules, then of course your soap's going to fall apart. But this will allow a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more leeway, that you can be a little bit more heavy-handed and get definitely a thicker line of colour in between the layers of your soap. My third thing that I dislike is the just sheer volume of mica that you see people adding to a soap. You see them ladling in spoonful after spoonful after spoonful all into a soap, and then they do several mica lines all on top of each other in between each layer. That is so much colourant going into a soap. A lot of us say that we like our homemade soaps because they're so much better that you can buy in the shop and all of that sort of stuff, and generally they usually are. But if you are literally just bunging loads and loads and loads of mica in just without a care in the world, is that really the best thing for your soap? Next thing is drag marks. Whenever you cut a soap that you've used mica lines with, it will cause drag marks going through your soap, which you then have to clean up to get a nice looking soap on the surface. Now, overall, you might say, well, that's not really a problem. I'll just clean that up off my soap, and that's great. But it is an extra process that you have to go through. And then the last one, I promise, is bleeding of the colour. Now, the reason this happens is that you've got a layer of mica that's not really incorporated necessarily properly into the soap like the other colour is. So as you use the soap, that raw mica just comes out over your washcloth, into your hands, and you do get that bleeding effect. Which, again, depending on the colours that you've used and how heavy-handed you've been with the mica, can actually make washing with the soap quite a messy process. We don't want that. Goodness me, look at me going on. Now, these are just my own personal reasons why, for me, I don't like using or doing mica lines. But I know a lot of people do absolutely love them. And I must admit, they do look gorgeous in a soap. So this is not an attempt to have a dig at people who like doing mica lines at all. What it is just to say, maybe, perhaps you find that you feel some of the things that I do about mica lines. Do you not like the mess? Do you find you've tried them but your soap falls apart and that sort of stuff? If that's the case, then maybe give something like this a try. It's just really to just give you another idea if you want to get a similar effect. So just finishing off the top of my soap, so I've just used some colours from further down on the top of my soap. Now how I tend to do this is I haven't saved a bit of soap from when I did it earlier. What I do is when I predisperse my micas in some oil, I do them in little stainless steel cups. I'm sure you've seen me do that. So if I know I want something left for the top, I just don't scrape those cups out fully. I just leave a little bit in there. And then when I get to my very top colour, I pour the tiniest bit of soap into those cups and mix that round, and then that just gives me a nice little bit of colour, freshly made, nice and fluid, to add to the top of my soap. So now this is finished, I'm going to cover it and pop it as normal, and then we'll cut it the next day. And here's our soap the next day. Can you spot the deliberate mistake? I forgot to press play as I pushed the cutter through, but remembered just before I start revealing the bars. So you can see here, here's our granule line going through. If you remember, I said I deliberately chose to leave my granules fairly coarse, so I've got a fairly coarse granule line. You could obviously blend yours smoother and get more like a mica line effect. But as you can see with these, I've got a thick line going through and my soap's not falling apart. Also you can see as where the cutter went through, there was no drag marks coming from an excess amount of mica. These soaps, as well as quite a few others that you may have seen in YouTube and some other ones that you haven't, are available from the 1st of April in the shop update. And then I'll just leave you with some pictures of the final soap. And also, do you remember at the beginning I spoke about how I use this granular technique when I do salt bars, and I love the effect and I think it gives a nice effect in the salt bars, and it's actually much easier to make the granules for those. I hope you've enjoyed this video and you like the soaps and this little granule technique. Really, it's just like very, very fine confetti soap, isn't it? If you have enjoyed the video, then why not give me a thumbs up? If you'd like to see what I'm doing in the future, then why not subscribe to my channel? Thanks for watching everyone. Happy soaping!